Jim Miller, head of elite athletics at USA Cycling. If he actually updated his coaching resume, on there you would see countless national and world championship athletes, Olympic gold, silver, and bronze medalists, and all this spanning across multiple disciplines in the sport of cycling. You've heard him on the TrainRight podcast before in episode 14 with one of the athletes he works with, Kate Courtney. If you haven't listened to that one, I really suggest going back and listening to it. It's hilarious, and there's a lot of good gold nuggets of training and coaching wisdom in there. But today is special because I sit down with Jim. It's just him and I talking about the athlete mindset and how the physical plays into that. We talk about how he actually coaches and trains athletes, and then we try to bridge that gap between the science and the art of coaching. I think that when you listen to it, you'll pull out a lot of good stuff that you can apply to your own training. And, I've known Jim for years, and I'm still learning about him. I'm still learning from him. And that's exactly what I think your experience will be today on the TrainRight podcast. Well, Coach Miller, you've been on the podcast before, so no need for a big intro. But for those listeners who haven't checked out the podcast with Kate Courtney, one of your athletes, go ahead and have a listen to that. But Jim, instead of an intro, can you tell our audience a little bit more about what has kept you in coaching in elite athletics for over 20 years now?
Yeah, thanks for having me again. Coaching, what is it? It's super addictive, huh? I think to some level it's that desire to feel a competitive need. When you're no longer an athlete, you get this competitive outlet from coaching athletes. It's a bit of the pursuit of goals and having some process to tackle. For me, I mean, I love the big audacious goals. Um, I love chasing them. I don't necessarily I'm not necessarily obsessed by them, but I love the process of working towards them and making a small step after small step after small step, and then by the time you lift up your head, you're at the goal, and you're like, wow, that's phenomenal. So I think all of that has some sort of attraction to it that pulls you in and just keeps you in it. I'd like to say. Uh, I had a CEO at Training Peaks who we had a conference, and he asked anybody who had ever been part of anything winning a state championship, winning a intramural league, winning uh, science projects, anything like that, to raise your hand. And of course, everybody's won at some level. He's like, is there any greater drug or addiction than that? And I literally thought as he's talking, I'm laughing. I'm like, no, actually, there's no greater drug. There's no greater addiction than that.
I was going to say that's a wonderful question.
Yeah, and it pulls you back in, and you can't get it off your mind. And it's really, it's funny because it is like I said earlier, the winning is awesome, but it's really that process of working towards it and putting the little pieces together that accumulate to this big goal or this win.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I mean, this is like already off script, Jim, but a question I was thinking about earlier today for you is if you had a magic ball and you could look in it and it said that, Jim, you will never again win as long as you coach, would you still coach?
I wouldn't believe that crystal ball.
I like that answer. But the process, I think that's it. And I was even thinking too, okay, if you had the crystal ball and it said that you would win every time, would you still coach?
Probably, yeah. But again, then I also wouldn't believe that crystal ball either.
Right. I was going to say the same crystal. Yeah, you wouldn't
Yeah,
believe it and that's the elusiveness, right, of competition.
it is. It is.
There's no guarantee. Yeah. Well, that's cool. I like that. I like that perspective. I like that. outlook, and I like to hear more of your history. I learn more every time we talk. So, but for our audience, please note this is actually round two of a one-on-one with Jim. The first time we tried this, we had some really bad audio, and bad on me because I couldn't figure out how to solve it. So this is round two. We had to scrap the first one. Some really good stuff in there, so we'll bring that out again, and as well as like just add on to it because it's going to be really good stuff. And what we're going to talk about today is the mindset of the athlete. So let's get right into it here, Jim. And where I want to start is the why. So the question is why is mindset such an important part of an athlete's success?
It really differentiates similar athletes from one another, in my
How
opinion.
so? How so?
Um, you can have a lot of athletes of the same relative ability, talent, uh, drive, um, but that there's always that one person with that mindset of I'm going to get this done, period, versus the person who's like, yeah, I would like to get it done, but not at this cost, or I'm not giving up this, or I'm not going to give up that. Um, but there's always the one who will, and that mindset is the winner. And talent be everything all equal. That's what separates them.
I like that. I like that. Um, so because it is so important, let's take a step back even further and let's define it a little bit further if we can. So give me the Jim Miller definition of mindset for an athlete.
Mhm. It's probably all over the board. You know, I think everybody wants to find the one person with the killer mindset, but I don't necessarily know that they come to you, or they find their way to you with just this killer mindset. I think it's something that has to be cultivated. It's cultivated through experiences and successes and failures and processes and training and racing. It's one of those things that I think you have to continually cultivate. You have to you have to praise it. You have to criticize it. You have to challenge it. Um, and over time, it's one of those things that just all of a sudden you have this killer mindset that allows you to be this competitor. And I think that happens in all walks of life, whether it's business, whether it's sport. It I don't think it necessarily is critical at what level, um, but I think it's just this collection of experiences. I got a Slack call. This collection of experiences that help cultivate that mindset, if you will.
Yeah, because you can't. I mean, you can't unravel, the athlete's life with or the competitor with the rest of their life, right? The athlete is one with that, and the mindset is how they think about their training, their racing, their life, the obstacles, the challenge, the victories, the defeats. It's I mean, it's everything, right?
It's all wrapped into it.
Yeah. And I guess could we go into some examples like since we're cycling, who in the cycling world, and this could be past, present, if you will, has one of the strongest mindsets you've ever seen? Who's a good
Ooh,
example of that?
I've seen some really good ones. I think the strongest for me is Kristin Armstrong for sure.
One
Um,
of your athletes, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
mentally an absolute warrior. Uh,
How so?
when she clocked in, she clocked in. Uh, but also a nice personality because when it was done, she could clock out and be done with it. But once you got her on a bike, and once you were in that competitive zone, uh, you had better be buckled in because she was not giving up easy.
I like that. We'll I've got a great Kristin Armstrong story here that we'll get into later, and we'll see that side of her a little bit more. But so Kristin Armstrong, one of the strongest mindsets out there. What are some, so go to the opposite end of the spectrum, and not necessarily to say one person, but what are some classic characteristics of an athlete who may not be strong mentally, or an athlete that needs to toughen up between the ears? What
Mhm.
are some characteristics of an athlete like that?
I think you can see it when they don't own the responsibility for the outcome. If
Yeah,
if
that's
they
good.
point at solutions like, well, it was because of this or because of that, or I just did what I was told. Um, I think when you don't own the outcome, then it allows you it allows you an out. So you can say, well, look, I did my job, and that was that, and I, I came in 15 minutes late, 15 minutes off the group, or I was 50th in the race because this wasn't my A race, so it doesn't really matter. I think when you start seeing people that point to other things, or blame other situations to answer their result, then that's a fairly weak mindset.
Excuses,
Hmm.
right? Yeah,
Exactly.
everybody's got one, and they don't
Yeah.
smell good.
Except the champion. The champions never do. They just take it. They take it on the
Yeah,
chin. They get knocked down. Uh, they get
that's
back
right.
up and they move straight on.
Yeah, that's right. As a coach, can you separate mind and body, or do you? And are there benefits in that way of thinking?
Yeah, I think you can. I do, anyways. If I write training, I'm physiologically trying to prepare an athlete for a competition and work through specific adaptations you want to see happen and develop. But in the process of that training, there's moments where you endure some hardships, or it's tough training, right? That's the point of endurance, is you endure,
Hmm.
um, and it gives you the opportunity to push and challenge somebody and mentally get them to go further than they were capable of going or they thought they could. Um, to be comfortable, more comfortable on longer than they had or they thought was possible. If you push on power and you want them to ride a little bit more power than they typically do in that workout, then you're challenging them, and it's the brain that has to make that happen, not necessarily the body. Um, I always have a story that I'll tell with Kristen, that I started working with her in 2002. It was, I don't recall exactly if it was the fall of 2002 or the spring of 2003, but she called me and says, it's raining here today. It's supposed to be a high of 40. It's 33 right now. What is the alternative workout you want me to do? And I'm like, what alternative? I was like, I want you to get on your bike, go outside and ride the workout I gave you. And she's like, but it's raining. And I'm like, what's that got to do with me? Kind of thing. And
Hmm.
she was mad, hung up the phone, went out and rode. Never in 15 years after that did she ever call me and ask me to change a workout, ever. And years later, 2007, winter of 2007, we're in Beijing looking at doing a recon on the Beijing time trial and road race course. And it's like 90% humidity, 25 degrees. I mean, freezing cold. And I'm like, well, it sucks. We can't ride. It's too cold to ride. I'm like, we'll just drive it and we'll get a feel for it. And she looked at me. She's like, I didn't fly to Beijing to drive in a car. And she's like, and if I recall, you ride in all weather conditions, period. I was like, and I'm like, oh Lord, I'm gonna have to ride in this stuff. And we rode 4 hours a day, 4 days in a row, 5 days in a row in this cold. And the very last day, she as we're getting ready to go outside, she hands me these little foot heaters that fit in your shoe, the stick-on ones that you get from Dick's or whatever.
Hmm.
She's like, "Oh, do you want to try some of these? They keep your feet warm all day." And I'm like, "Oh my God, have you had these the entire time?" And she's like, "Yeah, you can't survive in this cold and in this weather without some sort of heat." And I'm like, you could have shared these sooner. And she's like, you didn't have to make me ride in bad weather for like the last 8 years. And I'm like, okay, touche. But the point of the story being right is just by saying no that day, for 8 years, she mentally processed this, and she mentally was like, I'm tougher than the weather, and I can't call and ask for another workout because he's going to say no.
Yeah.
And sure, there's times to be smart, right? If you're sick and it's raining, yeah, you don't do that. But for the
Right.
most part, that kind of response just it elicited a mental change in her, and consequently, I recall in those years racing too in the springtime, never drop out of races, spring classics, raining, snowing, whatever. It never phased her, and I'm like, well, it's because you train in it every day. You do this all the time. It doesn't. When you see the rain on the window and you haven't got out of the car yet, it is what it is, and you just move on.
That's it. Yeah, that's it. And recognizing the facts without receiving the emotion that could be attached to it, right? Like
Mhm.
that's what it is. And you just say, okay, well, this is what I have to do, and those are the facts. Okay, let's do it.
Yeah, and
And yeah, go ahead.
even mental conditioning, right? I mean, nobody wants to go ride in 4 hours of 32-degree rain. And if you said do that straight out of the box, then you probably have nothing but failures. But
Hmm.
as you do it and do it and do it and do it and do it, all of a sudden it's like, you know what? It's not that bad.
Yeah. Yeah. And so and there's that physical that physical training and kind of that pain or the uncomfortableness of 32 and raining. Um let's talk about that because there is kind of mental training or kind of mental sharpening that comes through the physical, right? And
Hmm.
so how does the mind get cultivated through that physical training process? Like if you could explain that to our listeners? Like, why is hard training so important? Why is that train? What goes on mind body connection to make that happen?
Yeah, I think you have to. This is probably the way I explain it. I think there are times when you have to show an athlete how tough they actually are. Um, we don't know really how tough we are until we're put in a situation where we have to get through it and fight through it and do it. And I think all the time with an athlete, I get to a point where you're at this turning point, and you just have to show them how tough they are. Uh, this Kate epic that Kate does. I'd always wanted uh, mountain bike athletes to go to South Africa and race the Cape Epic before World Cup season. I'm like, what a perfect preparation. You get a nice 7 day stage race in with lots of volume, hard riding. It's a different format, 2 up, so it's fun. And then you recover from that, and you're essentially launched into a World Cup season. I'm like, it's perfect. And if you'd watched the years past, it was like every European guy did that, and I'm like, there's got to be something to this. I hadn't coached a lot of mountain bikers until right around 2016, and so I kind of had to put my money where my mouth was on that. Kate got an opportunity to ride the Cape Epic with Annika Langved, who at the time was reigning world champion, had won Cape Epic like 3 times in a row. She asked me if she should do it, and I was like, yeah, absolutely. She's like, I've never done a stage race before. And I'm like, ooh, that's a tough one to start with. Uh, right? You're
And
thinking,
yeah, and for our listeners, like the context here is Cape Epic, South Africa, early season, March time period, and it's like the World Series of mountain bike stage racing. It is like epic. It is crazy. It's gnarly. To bring some context here.
yeah. And, ideally we would have started with like a 3 day stage race or a 4 day stage race, but it wasn't available. And I'm like, yeah, tell them yes. And I'm like, we'll make sure you're prepared for it.
Yeah,
And
we
so
got
we,
this.
we essentially devised a training plan that concluded with the Kate Epic. And the Kate Epic simply replicated the race demands and the kilojoules or TSS of what the Cape Epic would be. And and so we built her up to a point where she could give the Kate Epic a go. And it was hard. And she's in day 7 of this. And I finished it with like what I think is the world's most nasty workout, which is 5x5. VO2s. She's already got a ton of load in her legs. She sees it. I know she's going to call me that day um, and ask me if she should do that workout. She does. I don't. I didn't pick up the phone. I let it ring. Wait. I'm sitting there waiting by the phone essentially. It rings like 45 minutes later, and it's her. And I'm like, I know what the question is, um, but you have to work through this yourself. This is where you become mentally tough. You're going to decide whether you're going to complete this or you're going to quit. And I was just curious on what it was going to be. Is she gonna finish or is she gonna quit? In
So
the end,
how hard were these 5x5s for our listeners to
five
get the
by five,
context of?
5x5 is a VO2, so right around 115% of FTP.
Okay. And she was doing this the final day of
Yeah,
a 7, 8 day block?
yeah, correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Uh, Probably, oh man, oh, if I'm guessing, I don't know. I couldn't guess on the kilojoules at this point. Anyway, it's not important, but a lot of load.
Yeah.
We're probably up around 25, 30 hours at this point.
Yeah. So
Um,
over, I mean, 1200 TSS plus probably
yeah,
for the week.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Big week.
yeah.
Okay. Okay.
That's probably was probably closer to 1400 TSS. So
Okay.
she has a lot of load in her.
Yep.
The phone rings, I don't answer. The phone rings again, I don't answer. And I know it's hard, right? I'm very empathetic towards what she's going through at
Yep.
this moment in
Yep.
time. And then the phone rings a third time, and I pick it up. I'm like, "How'd you do?" And she's like, borderline tears, and she's like, "That was mean. That was the hardest thing I've ever done." She's like, "You would never do that to anybody else." And I'm like, "But did you finish?" She's like, "Yes." I'm like, "Did you hit the power?" She's like, "Yes." I'm like, "See, you're capable of it." And guess what? The Cape Epic will be nowhere near as difficult as this. So I'm like,
Yeah.
now you know you can do the Cape Epic. And and then you could almost feel her demeanor change, and she laughs and she's like, "I literally laid down on the ground between reps." She's like, "I didn't ride, I didn't recover, I laid down and cried sometimes." And I'm like, "But you got up and you did them." And she's like, "Yes." I was like, "Because you're not a quitter. You didn't quit. And now you know how deep you can dig." And
Yeah.
now 2, 3 years later on, uh, she is absolutely a mental warrior herself. I mean, she is as tough as Kristin mentally. I have as much respect for her warrior spirit as I do Kristin's. Uh, but that was like a big step for her to realize that, hey, I can do this, and I can dig way deeper than I thought I could.
Yeah. Yeah. Those are huge moments in an athlete, and in what you're talking about is building that resiliency,
Hmm.
in the belief that they are resilient enough. And I was there that year in South Africa, and I remember because we had a group of athletes that we were kind of shuttling through and making sure that they were at the pointy end and all the way at the tail end, and I was at the finish line every stage, and I remember seeing Kate because correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that there was no American had won that race before, and that
Correct.
was actually Howie and Kate both actually won that year, which is
Yeah.
ironic.
Yeah.
Um, but I remember I mean, she was in the pain cave, she was going for it, but like pretty much every stage coming in, Annika's wheel, just like charging hard, just like that classic Kate, like I am doing this, I am getting this, and it was impressive, man, because that's a gnarly race.
Yeah. And at that time she's coming out of U23, so that's her first
Right, she
Olympic
was
race.
young, yeah,
Yeah.
she was young,
And Annika was definitely the queen then, and
yeah,
reigning world champion, uh, big strong girl, probably have better absolute powers.
yeah,
Burning breath
yeah,
more
that's
than
right.
Kate's in the flats, 40 watts.
Yep,
So she could turn the screws to Kate big time in that terrain.
yep, yep. But that resiliency, and that's just a wonderful example of how to build resiliency in an athlete, because you have a goal that they don't know that they can do, and you walk them through it, right? You simulate the stress, you simulate the intensity, you simulate the gnarliness that will be achieved. And how how soon did you end the Kate epic before the Cape epic? How much recovery did she have in between?
We gave her a fair amount because she hadn't done that large of a week before. I
Hmm.
think I gave her a good 2 weeks after that of pretty light riding, pretty much recovery. Um, then we had a week that we could open back up. That takes a little bit.
Hmm.
And then she flew over to South Africa and joined the team. And they also had a World Cup before the Cape that year, so
Hmm.
she had a bit of chance to fire the engine before the Cape.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's good. And so when we're talking about resiliency, it's the capacity to recover quickly from those difficulties or the toughness, right? And that I guess where I'm going with that is you're building that throughout the lifespan of an athlete too. So it's not only just for that one. What she learned during the hashtag Kate Epic, she's now applying to after her world championship and leading into Tokyo, right?
Yep, yep, daily. I mean, those are cumulative experiences, and they build upon themselves, and I think that's what ends up making champions and winners is they become so resilient, and they can move past failure and move from it so fast that the normal person just it blows them away. But that's what really what resiliency is, right? It's like get
Hmm.
knocked down, stand back up, keep moving.
That's it. That's it. So let's shift back to the mind, and in particular, what goes on in the mind during those tough, tested moments when resiliency is being built, I guess, or maybe denied, right? And I think in sports psychology or coaching, we talk about self talk for an athlete.
Hmm.
Okay. And so it's, a word or words that are repeated,
Yep.
throughout this process. So how important is self talk for an athlete? Would you say?
I think it's super important. I compare it to checking the gauge in the car. Uh, when you're really deep into an interval or a race, or you're in the gutter, or you're climbing, and it's massively uncomfortable, you have this deep desire to always check the gauges. Uh, what is that? If you check the gauge and say I can't, you immediately blow up. But if you check the gauge and say I can, you tend to go to the next reflector pole and to the next reflector pole and to the next reflector pole, and you can survive. Um, that's I mean, I don't know if that's a great analogy, but that's how I always
No.
look at it. And I think Kate's famous for her mantras. She always has mantras. She even comes up with weekly mantras. That's her thing. I actually really like them, and it's sort of started to adopt mantras for myself. So it's a bit of the student teaching the teacher now, but I think they're really good. In those very moments, you don't have a lot of cognitive process, anyways. And
Yeah.
if you can have just one or two things that trigger that positive outcome, it's like awesome. You need those.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And oftentimes, like you said, it's whether it's one word or a phrase, you make it very simple, and because everything else, hopefully, is a bit on autopilot at that moment, right?
Hmm.
And I think that the importance of a mantra, what I've communicated with my athletes, the importance of a mantra is to have something in there that repeats you of kind of why you're there to keep you grounded in the present moment, and also because of the potential negotiations that happen in the negative self-talk, if you
Hmm.
will,
Yeah,
to say, okay, this is hurting, I need to slow down, I'm going to die, I'm going to, all these like things,
yeah,
that we say to ourselves. And so I think the mantras are huge, right?
yeah.
And so how can, like, for our listeners, how can they check the gauge? Like, how do you do that with your athletes? Is it like a reflective process after a hard workout or a race? Is it like a journaling thing? Do you talk to him on the phone? I mean, how do you do it in coaching?
Yeah, all the above, right? For me, that. and we talked about this with the last interview with Kate, that relationship with the athlete is critical for me.
Hmm.
I can look at metrics, I can look at any set of data, I can dice and slice it any way I want. I can even get that data to tell me the story I want to see. Um, but there comes a point where I want to hear what they have to say, and and especially in the feedback stage, with coaching, I think the feedback is the hard part. Um, One, doing it, because if you're delivering bad, or if you're critiquing, it's difficult, because it's not fun. Nobody wants to tell somebody they were terrible, or they did a bad job, or they could have done this better. But that's a critical step of the process. Um, but I always start off with, what do you think, and let them talk, and I want to hear what they have to say. And I may have had a different view in my mind of what happened in the race, or how the tactic played out, or what I thought I saw. They walk me through what they think, and a lot of times they can even change my mind, where I'm like, okay, well, look, I agree with that. Um, but it's that communication, and hearing what they say, and listening to it, and uh, digesting that, along with all the analytics you take in.
Yeah. Yeah. That's beautifully put. Yeah. And so, how would you? So, Kate's kind of creating her own mantras, and she's teaching you a thing or two. One that I really liked was, she believes she could, so she did, and that was before she won the world championship. Um, how do you guys do it, or like how would you say a listener here could create their own mantra? Like, where do you start from in terms of finding that one word or the phrase?
I think the key is, it has to mean something to you. Um, you can adopt mantras. Geez, I think with Instagram and memes now, you see mantras all day long, and sometimes you read mantras on Instagram, and you're just like, yes, and
Yeah.
that could be a mantra. Uh, so I think they're just things that have to mean something to you, and if they do, then they resonate with you, and because they resonate with you, that's a typically a positive thing in your brain. Um, and in those moments, like we said earlier, you get into this in the box, and your cognitive processes are just not that powerful, and you just need the one thing that you can rely on, and that pulls you through.
Yeah. I like that. So would you say you have self-talk as a coach before big races, big events, or I don't know, devising a training program?
All the time, I have so many conversations going in my own brain that it's crazy. But I'm more of an introverted thinker, more so
Yeah.
than an extroverted feeler, so that's natural to me. But yeah, all the time, I'm thinking about things, and working through it, and even at times reminding myself that we checked the boxes, and this is going to be okay. This is going to go well.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I would agree with you on that regard too. Much more introverted in the way I'm thinking, but despite what my wife might say, there's always a lot going on up there between the ears.
I know you can you can not say a word for hours, but in your mind you've had these full conversations, and you're exhausted.
Oh, it's incredible. I can just stare at a wall and think for hour for
Hmm.
sure.
Easy,
Yeah,
easy. I
absolutely.
rarely ride with music. Lately, I've been riding with audibles and podcasts, but
Hmm.
almost always I ride just solo, and just churn on things and ideas, and I can commit 3 4 hours to almost a single idea, just like thinking about it, and processing it.
100%. In fact, I mean, we're recording this during our little pandemic here, and so we're riding a lot solo, and I have to, like, I'm enjoying it.
Hmm.
It's 3 4 hours. I know no one's gonna want to ride. I know that there's not a lot of traffic out on the road, and I know I'm not going to see anybody. So it's like time alone. It's great.
Yeah, and you get some great thinking done.
Oh, it's incredible. Yeah, yeah. Um, so as we kind of bring back to the athlete in the mindset, clearly there's a process to developing a winning athlete, and you've done this at the highest level in sport for years and years. And there's not only a desire to win, but there needs to be that relentless pursuit to do what it takes physically, mentally, tactically to sacrifice. And so now I want to talk about competing versus winning. Okay. And I'll first start with a quote. I want to hear your thoughts on it. And the quote is, "You don't compete with anyone. You find your opponent's weakness and you strike." That's by Tim Grover. What are your thoughts on that, Jim?
It makes me smile.
Okay. Why does it make you smile?
A little bit dubious sounding, but that's competition. That's what you're doing. You're trying to figure out how to beat somebody. And the easiest way to beat them is if you can beat them through their weaknesses, because that's where they're not the best. I think if you break down races, tactics, events, disciplines to what they are, then that's what you're really doing is searching for those weaknesses in teams, those weaknesses in athletes, um, where you can beat them. And sometimes it's just a long, long, long poker game until you get to that scenario, and then you're like, boom, play the card, and down they go. That book, Tim Grover, Relentless, happens to be one of my favorite books. It's one of the few books that I read back to back a couple times.
It's a good book. It's a
It
good
is a
book.
very good book.
Yeah.
It's
Uh,
a little bit
when it,
dark,
yeah,
but
it is. And you have to, in truth be told, like, I wouldn't say it's for everybody because it's offensive at times. It ruffles some feathers.
it does. And there's times where you're like, I don't know if I agree with that, because it doesn't
Yeah.
make the nicest person. Um, but in the context of sport or competition, it resonates.
Well, so it's interesting you say that. Twofold. One, don't read it before bed. When I first started reading, I was like, oh God, like there's no way I can go to sleep right now after reading like 20 pages. So for those listeners, if you do pick up Relentless by Tim Grover, don't read it before bed. But secondly, I guess the questions are: is this essential? Is this thought essential, or this concept essential for the highest level of sport? Do we need to think this way as coaches and athletes?
Um, I don't know. I think there's a lot of ways to skin a cat. It's not the only way. This book talks a lot about Kobe and Michael Jordan, uh, the way they process sport, the way they thought about sport, the way they approach sport. Um, and it's probably really timely now with this Michael Jordan
Mm-hmm.
series out on ESPN, which is also really good. Um, it just gives you a glimpse to how they live their life. I think to win at really high levels, there is some misbalance in life if you look at it straight up. But I think in their lives, there's no loss in balance. They're pursuing what they're pursuing. Um, I find myself after big like Olympic Games, World Championships, even where you've won, like the very next morning, thinking about what's next, or I've already thought what we have to do in the next 3 months or the next 6 months, and it's just something that has always happened with me, where as quickly as I move on from failure, I as quickly move on from success as if it didn't happen. It wasn't long ago that I'd put together a bio, and I never put together bios. I never put together resumes. When I was a bike racer, I had a saying that if you're fast enough, you didn't need a resume. They would just call you. Um, and I've kind of carried that into my professional life too. I'm like, if you're good enough, you don't have to have a resume. They just call you. Um, and then as I was doing it, I'm like, I almost don't believe this bio myself. Uh, and it kind of struck me because I'd never stopped and even looked at it and never thought twice about it. Um, when Kristin won a gold medal, it's like we're just moving straight on. Most of the time, it was to a World Championships that was happening in 6 weeks. You would enjoy the moment, have a great night, But for me, when I was in those Olympic Games, then we were just on to the next event and the next discipline, and you just moved on that fast. So I think it's an odd mindset. I don't think it's every person has that mindset, but I think some do. So to answer your question, that was a perfect answer, non-answer. I don't think it has to be that way. No, um, I do think it's probably common amongst people at that level that's how it works, but I don't think it's required.
Yeah. I mean, it is a classic. I mean, it's a classic characteristic of high performers. I mean, you can find a lot of examples of that, but yeah, not every high performer is necessarily like that. I think we're all quirky in our own ways, and the higher you go, the more pronounced kind of that is. But in terms of stomping on throats, like Grover talks about, I mean that is one way, right?
Yep.
And and I guess to talk, I guess let's transition into like some Kristen stories because definitely she definitely was like that when it was time to go. Like she was she was ready to stomp on any throat that was in the way, right? And but through that, I mean, she didn't win everything, right? There was failure along the way.
Yep.
And I remember, I think it was it's 2015 to 2016 into the Olympics, and I was working with 2016 UCI team, and she made her comeback. And at the National Time Trial Championships, she just got on the podium. She took third, and that did not secure a spot for Rio. So she was in a tough place. And I remember Joe drove her back to the homestay or whatever, wherever we were staying, and I remember driving the rest of the team back, right? And it was dark, right? Because everybody you know everybody expected her to win and thought she would, and she didn't. But it was like the darkest of clouds, the craziest of crazies, and everybody was like quiet. I mean, we were packing trainers up, and I mean, it was just no talking, right?
Mhm.
So I'm driving the girls back and not really knowing what to say. So we're trying to make some light humor. It just didn't work really. But later in it, but that's how she received failure. But it wasn't this woe is me. It was like, there was like this fire lit that I had never like experienced before.
Yep.
and she just got like real focused, real angry. And it was like she was a different. I mean, and you've seen this. You worked with her for years, but for me, before that time trial, and then after that time trial, all the way through, and she ended up winning the gold at
Mhm.
Rio. So she was changed. But I guess the question is, how did you and Kristen devise a plan, or how did you navigate through in order to win the gold medal after that failure?
Yeah, her her intensity in racing, especially with the time trials, uh, it wasn't comfortable for anybody. And it wasn't necessarily comfortable for her. Wasn't comfortable for me. It definitely was not comfortable, but for anybody around her. Uh,
And poor Joe
Joe
Trooper.
and Joe used to always say in time trial weeks, he's like, "She's yours this week. I don't want her,"
Yeah, yeah.
and he meant that. Uh, and she was mine because I was the coach, and somebody had to deal with her. Um,
Hmm.
so with those personalities, there comes some. They can be tough. Uh, it, their strength can be their weakness. Um, and she could be wicked tough in those time trial weeks. But for her, that was the process of mentally preparing for what was coming. Um, and that was the laser lock in. Uh,
Hmm.
that year in particular, she had met some criteria. Uh, there was a piece in the criteria language that said you had to show that you were capable of riding at a world tour level, because she had a family, had a kid, had Lucas, was a mother. She couldn't just go to Europe and race like everybody else. So there was Tour California that year, World Tour event, uh, and she had to race it. And she had to show that she could ride at that level. And and in the language, it didn't say, this is how you demonstrate you can ride that level. So we took it in the literal terms of, well, if you're asking me, can you ride at that level? I'm going to ask you, can you podium? And if you can't, then I'm going to say you can't ride that level. Sorry. Yeah, you can follow, but you can't ride.
Mm-hmm.
So she went to California, ended up third on GC, I think, maybe second. I don't recall exactly. But then had to fly out to, was it in Georgia? Was it South Carolina somewhere?
Yeah, South Carolina, maybe Winston-Salem, maybe.
Yeah, and it was in California that year was cool and rainy,
Mm-hmm.
just 4 days, and it's blazing hot and high humidity.
Yeah,
Uh, the thing with the Olympics is if you want to win them, you can't dance around it. That has to be your peak. In a normal year, I would say, yeah, we can have 2, 3 peaks, 2 for sure. If there's a third one that we want to try for, we can try for it. But in Olympic year, everybody brings their A game to the Olympics. Everybody is on, and you have to have a true high peak. You have to be that player on that day that does it.
so what you're saying is, you like in an Olympic year, you're aiming for one peak, right?
Correct.
Okay. And that year, 2016, when Kristin took third at nationals, that was it. Maybe looking back on it, maybe part of the plan, because you're going for Rio, which was in August, right?
Yeah. So that event itself wasn't part of the selection criteria. So when we looked at the season as a whole and how to build it and how to set it up, that was an event that she didn't have to prioritize or she could sacrifice, if you will. Um, you know, for her in a time trial, she never wanted to lose anyways. It didn't matter if it was a prologue or a hour record. If it involved time trial bars, she expected to win. And
Right.
for a long time, she expected to win by a significant margin. So, later in her career, it got to the point where if she didn't win by a large margin, then people started questioning her, even though she still won the race.
Right.
So in that year, it's just the way it was set up and the way we attacked it and approached it was that was a sacrificable event, and it didn't factor into the entire picture or body of work that was supposedly to be reviewed by a selection committee. And so yeah, she got caught out. She got caught on a day where she wasn't 100%, was probably 85%, and for a lot of reasons, coming off a hard stage race,
Yeah.
coming from cool weather to warm weather and humidity, and she got beat.
Yeah.
And that's about all you can say to it. And
Yeah.
for her, and that analogy of post race, we always you can be mad for 24 hours, you can be furious, you can be irate, uh, but after that 24 hours, then it's over, and we will debrief and we'll have a fair conversation about it, and move on. And that's essentially what she did that year. And the plan wasn't in May, the plan was in July.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. And the um and if I recall right now, like everybody was cracked too. I mean, there was athletes were not performing well coming off Tour of California, like you said, and I think it was like 1 week turnaround. Like California ended, we had like 6 days, and staff,
Yeah.
athletes, I mean, the,
Yeah. Most
everybody,
everybody drove straight cross country and,
yeah, everybody was
and,
cracked.
and had
Remember that.
2 days to preview and shake out and go for it.
which is it's all part of it too. I mean, that's part of the other challenge of being an athlete.
Yeah. Part of the game.
Yep.
Part of the
Yeah.
game.
So, okay, so even if you're not competing for a gold medal, but like many of our listeners probably are in that boat, right? They're not going for a world championship or anything like that. But could our listeners benefit from cultivating this winning mindset that you do with your athletes?
Oh, absolutely. And everything. Um, I mean, I even work on it with myself, my own kids.
How so?
And it's just that continuing, uh, to challenge yourself, to to try to be better, to do something more efficient, to think about it a little bit differently. I think those all play into just everyday life and how you approach life. So I think 100% that kind of mindset cultivates into a lot of different things. I also think that's why you see so many athletes become great at business when they retire. Is they have that drive, they have that work ethic. They challenge themselves innately. They don't need a boss challenging them to do it better, to do it quicker, to make it cheaper, to sell it faster. It's just something that they do because that's how they live their lives.
Yeah, yeah, that's it. I mean, with every one of my athletes, professional athlete or professional person, that's the carryover from sport to everything in life is it. And if I'm working with a professional athlete, I always bring that up. In terms of like
Mhm.
think long term, like where are we going to take this ability, this itch that needs to be scratched, this perspective of something needs to get won today, something needs to get crushed. Where are you going to take that?
Yeah,
Right?
yeah. It crosses all genres.
Yeah. Yeah, it really does. Yeah. So reflection time here, coach. You've mentioned a little bit of what you learned from your athletes, but what else have your athletes taught you about mindset?
I would give the athletes I've worked with as much credit for teaching me about mindset as I've taught them. Um, it's one thing to challenge athletes and to push them and take them to places they don't want to be, or they haven't been, or they didn't think they could be there. But I think if you're the coach that does that, you also have to take it back. You have to accept that when they do that to you, um, and consequently, it forces you to be more prepared. It forces you to think through what you're doing longer or with more clarity. Um, so so I think it's absolutely two-way street. I think they absolutely have taught me as much as I've taught them, and I expect it. I certainly uh, I don't necessarily always like the challenges or invite them, but I allow them, and that's part of the deal. If you're going to challenge, then you have to accept challenge.
Yeah, no, I like that, and I think if you're going to coach high performers, you better be ready for a little resiliency training yourself as a coach. Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. Oh, I love it. I love it. Well, Jim, we're kind of rounding off our time here together, and we've talked a bunch about mindset training, resiliency, self talk, and all really good stuff that I think our listeners are gonna really appreciate. But now I want to transition into our takeaways, where I ask you some questions and answer away, and it's going to kind of come from every angle. So if you're ready, we'll get into this thing.
Fire.
Okay. All right. So this is for the young developing athletes out there or the parents listening to the podcast. What advice would you give them if they wanted to start now in developing into a professional athlete?
Um, Play sports. Play all sports. Play any sport you like. Play it at any level you like to play it at. Um, Race all bikes, cyclocross, road, gravel, track, whatever you have access to. Um, do it all. The experiences are what creates the knowledge, um, and the more experiences you take away, the more knowledge you build. But I would say do it all.
Yeah. Diverse.
Uh, if I have junior athletes that run cross country in high school and they're like, "Oh, my cross country season starts August 1st," I'm like, "Great, go do it. Run away. Um, Race bikes on the weekends if you want, but get after it."
I like that. I like that. And it's for that broad base and that broad diversity early on.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think an athlete's an athlete, right? At the top of the higher you go, an athlete's just an athlete. It doesn't matter when you got in the sport or where you came into it or what your background is, but um, training yourself to be an athlete is that's key. And it's a collection of sports, and then balance and hand-eye coordination and depth perception on a road bike or something. It all comes from various experiences and situations you put yourself in.
Yeah, and all the more important to develop that when you are young and you're more of a sponge to absorb.
Mhm.
And I think coaching's very similar, right? Where it's like, if you consider yourself an elite cycling coach, is it, well, can you are you an elite coach? Like, can you coach anything? Can you coach other things? And I remember, I think the first time we talked, you talked about coaching your daughter's volleyball team, right?
My son's fourth grade basketball
Sons,
team.
okay, that's what it was. So, what was your
Yeah,
experience
and it
there?
was tough. It was tough. I mean, it was super tough. This was 2008,
Yeah.
and I mean that year I have an Olympic gold medalist in the stable, and that fourth grade basketball team, I was spending half a day at work coming up with practices that afternoon, uh, so that we could have good practices and they would learn something, and it was incredibly tough. And but it makes you, I think, to coach, you should just coach it all. For the same exact reasons we talked about, an athlete is experience is knowledge, and more experiences is more knowledge.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. Okay, we got a little. We answered a lot of questions there, but let's go on to question 2. For the weekend warriors out there, what kind of mindset should they bring into their group rides and races once this pandemic is over?
Yeah, I'm a bit different on this. Uh, I know the warrior mentality that I cultivate in my athletes, and they bring to a race. But on a weekend, if I'm a masters racer, uh, I want to be there. I want to be fit. I want to have fun. I want to race hard. Uh, but I don't want to take massive chances and break collarbones. I mean, at the end of the day, uh, you still have to go back to work on Monday. Um, so I think it's for the weekend warriors, just sometimes you do have to keep it in perspective, and you can show up and you can absolutely compete. You can absolutely challenge. You can challenge yourself, um, but you don't have to take all the risk that that maybe a professional athlete takes as part of their profession.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with that. I mean, it's a cost benefit situation in that regard, and I think the takeaway there is just as amped up and as exciting as high performance culture and gold medals and talking about some of this high level stuff is, like, bring it down to where you're at, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so question 3: what is one thing that our listeners can start doing right now in their training to improve their mental toughness and resiliency?
Hmm. Not give yourself an out in workouts.
Mm, that's good. Yeah.
I think that's really important. Um, if in the back of your mind when you're starting a hard interval set, you're already starting to think of ways to that you could make it acceptable to quit, uh, you've lost the plot. So I would say don't give yourself an out on those hard days.
Yeah, that's gold. That's truly gold. Well, because that answer was so good, Jim, you get a bonus question. And that is
Okay.
and that is, what book or podcast, because we've been sharing podcasts lately. What book or podcast would you recommend to our audience if they wanted to cultivate this winning mindset?
Well, we already talked about Tim Grover's Relentless.
Hmm.
I like that book a lot. Um, yeah, I'm trying to think of what I'm listening to right now. Right now, I'm onto a different kind of topic. I'm listening to a lot of Rich Roll.
Oh, really?
Um, he gets a lot of really interesting guests, and it's a lot about a lot of things I don't know anything about. So I find it, I've just found it captivating lately. Um,
I like it.
yeah, yeah.
Cool.
So that's where I'm at.
Yeah.
Uh, I'll always recommend Tim Grover.
Cool. Okay. So Tim Grover and Rich Roll. I remember I've listened to a little bit of Rich Roll, but I'll go back to it on my next 4-hour ride in solitude.
That's super good.
Yeah.
And his podcasts are long, so it'll suck up some time.
Yeah. Good. Good. Okay, Coach. Well, if our audience wants to follow you on the road to Tokyo, where can they find you on the socials?
Uh, Both Twitter and Instagram are Jim Miller Time.
Jim Miller Time. Okay. Excellent. Well, Jim, thank you again for what is actually round 3, if we include the duo podcast with Kate. So thank you so much for being, a very frequent member on the TrainRight podcast. And if it happens again, I'll be stoked. So
Yes, excellent.
okay, we'll go out there in Colorado and go get a ride or a hike in today.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Okay,
Have a good day.
thanks, Jim.